Here, and this is the third in a series at the LBJ School of Public Affairs on the subject of poverty now. And I'm James Galbraith, and I'm co-hosting this series with my friend and colleague Patricia Ruggles. And today we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Gregory Axe, who is the Vice President for Income and Benefits Policy at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. Works on social insurance, on social welfare, on compensation questions. He has recently published on unemployment and on the problem of low wages, welfare policy. He was formerly with the Congressional Budget Office and has held offices with APAM, the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management. He's a fellow of the National Poverty Center at the University of Michigan, and therefore a member of the Michigan Mafia on poverty questions. His topic today is developing individual and community metrics to measure mobility from poverty. And we have a short hour, so we'll yield the floor to Dr. Axe. He can talk for 25, 30 minutes, and we'll then take it from there. Patricia Ruggles will make some comments. I may ask some questions, and we'll open it to the floor for questions from the audience. Dr. Axe, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. And I am going to share my screen. And with any luck, you're seeing a slideshow beginning.
We are.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today about some work we've been doing at the Urban Institute on developing individual and community level metrics to measure mobility from poverty. Rather than talk about a specific paper, I'll be talking about two related bodies of work. One that started about 5 years ago at the Urban Institute called the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, and then a newer body of work that's been going on for about 2 years on boosting upward mobility metrics to inform local action. So beginning with the Partnership on Mobility from Poverty. Around 5 years ago, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation became very interested in domestic poverty here in the U.S., and particularly, why has it been so persistent? Why haven't we really made a lot of progress on bringing poverty down? And so they came to the Urban Institute to stand up this partnership with the goal of trying to investigate what would it really take if we wanted to substantially increase mobility from poverty. And we assembled a partnership of 24 experts from academia across disciplines: economists, sociologists, political scientists, social psychologists, as well as practitioners, heads of community college systems, those who are running programs, and went out into communities around the country, places like Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, the Mississippi Delta, Native American populations such as the Lummi Nation, and then places like San Jose, where you have pockets of poverty in places where you have booming economic conditions. And the idea of this partnership was, we didn't want to come to a consensus, something watered down, but to come up with ideas and notions and things we could try to really increase mobility from poverty. And one of the key insights that sort of informed and imbued all that work and subsequent work was that poverty is about more than just money. It's about power and autonomy. It's about dignity. It's about being valued in society. And so if you wanted to increase mobility from poverty, you needed to make progress on all three key dimensions: economic success, power and autonomy, and being valued in community. And if you're only making progress on one of those dimensions, you're probably not going to have sustained success. So, for example, if you take someone $1 or even $100 above the poverty line, you haven't really improved their situation very much. If you made someone, helped someone develop a life plan and a set of actions and gave them a sense of power and autonomy going forward, that's great. But if that doesn't translate into improved material well-being, improved sense of dignity as well, that success is going to be short-lived. Similarly, if you went into community and did some community organizing, you could have folks believe that they're, have improved social capital, improved connectedness. But if that didn't translate into more control over how community resources were spent, how communities were being policed, if you didn't see improvements in material well-being, those gains would dissipate quickly as well. So to have sustained significant increases in mobility from poverty, you need to treat these as co-equal, and you need to make progress on all three fronts. So again, to increase mobility from poverty, you have to hit all three dimensions. And then if you want to make progress, you need to be able to measure it. So that's the peroration of the talk. And so I'm going to divide the talk into two parts. First, focusing on the economic security aspect. Can't do a talk entirely without numbers. So also, I had to put in numbers for fat, right?
Very true.
That to talk about how much mobility is there in the US, and then talk about how we can measure all aspects of it. So there are a couple of different concepts for mobility. The first is basically relative mobility among your peers. So much of this is taken from tabulations from the panel study of income dynamics. Basically, we start with folks ages 25 to 34, and we rank everyone by income and put them in quintiles. And we're focusing on folks in the bottom quintile, the bottom 20%. And we ask 10 years later, where do you rank compared to your peers? How many folks who were in the bottom when they were 25 to 34 are still in the bottom when they're 35 to 44? And the answer is about half, slightly over half the folks who are in the bottom among their peers are still in the bottom a decade later. And that's true across several generations. Folks who start in the bottom, even those who do escape the bottom, don't get very far. So over 75, close to 80% of folks who started in the bottom are still in the bottom among their peers. Now, if that's not great, but if everyone, your entire cohort is getting much richer, is it really that bad if you're still in the bottom 20%? So another way to look at mobility is to look at absolute mobility. And that's to say that, we will set the line for the 20th percentile, 40th percentile on up at a given point in time, adjusted for inflation, and then ask those folks who are in the bottom quintile, did their incomes grow up and move them in what would have been higher quintiles? Are they experiencing absolute mobility? And as you can see, this picture on absolute mobility doesn't look very different from the picture on relative mobility. Slightly under half the folks who are in the bottom quintile 10 years later still have incomes that would have left them in the bottom quintile. About 75% of folks who are in the bottom quintile are still in the bottom two quintiles. So among your peers, there's not a lot of mobility. Now, when people think of mobility, they also think about intergenerational mobility. Question being, if a child is raised in a low-income family in the bottom income quintile, what are the chances that they are in some higher quintile or the same quintile as they reach adulthood, as they're into adulthood? And I'd like to draw your attention to the lower left and the upper right parts of this chart. So for children who were born into families, they're in the bottom, spent the early childhood in the bottom quintile, 37% are in the bottom quintile as adults. About 2/3 are in the bottom two quintiles. So if you're born at the bottom, spend your early years in the bottom, chances are you'll be towards the bottom as an adult. Conversely, there's stickiness at the top. If you were born into the top quintile, 40% of those kids are still in the top quintile as adults. 2/3 are in the top two quintiles. Now, this picture of mobility for children washes out some important racial and ethnic differences. So when we break this down comparing Black children to white children. It's the PSID. So at this point, we don't have enough Latina folks to break them out. 64% of Black children who are in the bottom income quintile are in the bottom quintile as adults. Only 3% make it all the way up to the top quintile. For white children, only 26% of white children who were in the bottom quintile remain in the bottom quintile as adults. So when you're talking about mobility, you really do have to think about the different economic structures, social structures, factors that affect mobility by race. Absolute mobility, here we're borrowing some work from Raj Chetty and team, looking at whether kids do better than their parents, the quintessential American dream story. You know, in the early post-war years, it was a fairly good bet. 90% of kids out-earned their parents. You know, later on, down into the 80s for millennials, it's a 50-50 proposition. So there's not a ton of mobility, and mobility seems to be shrinking across generations. Comparing the US to other countries, and here we're just looking at the correlation between fathers' earnings and sons' earnings, the US has appreciably less mobility than most other developed nations. So we see that there is sort of limited economic mobility in the US, especially when we're focusing here on, you know, the economic success aspect of mobility. And we pose the question, is that partially because we are only focusing on economics and not on other important aspects of mobility, power and autonomy, and being valued in community? So because we don't measure it, we don't think about it. So the work that we've done at Urban establishes that we can measure all three dimensions. And again, I'm going to talk about individual metrics for mobility based on work from the US Partnership on Mobility, and then community level metrics based on our current work on boosting upward mobility. The next discussion on individual level metrics is based on a paper on measuring mobility from poverty that was co-authored by folks at the Urban Institute, one of the US Mobility Partnership members, Jennifer Eberhardt from Stanford, and a team of scholars also from Stanford. Here you can see the example of lexicographic advantage and privilege to having a last name that begins with an A. I thank my father for that. Now, the paper demonstrates and suggests a number of different ways to measure all three aspects of mobility from poverty, but more useful than the paper is the Measuring Mobility Toolkit that lives on the Spark website at Stanford that provides a set of metrics for all three dimensions of mobility that we think are important to measure. And these metrics have been vetted by scholars and used and shown a link to various aspects of mobility from poverty. And we are using these metrics in our work, and we would encourage other folks who are looking at mobility to use the metrics to get a broader sense of why communities are resilient, why programs work or don't work. So for example, if you're trying to figure out why a particular training program is effective in one site and not another, or short-term effects and then phasing out, and you're tracking things like employment and earnings, perhaps you can ask questions about, you know, how are the people participating in the program doing in terms of their feeling of control over their lives, their feelings of dignity. Similarly, if you're doing a study of, say, community resilience in the wake of COVID, consider not just asking about economic factors, but also feelings of social inclusion, feelings of power and autonomy. So if you go to the toolkit, this would be your cover page. And then you can see for each of the three dimensions of mobility, we have a series of measures. If you would like to select a measure, you can target the audience or the subject that you want to look at, whether it's a child, a teen, or adult. We have information on reading levels for the questions, the amount of time each question takes. Let me blow up the print a little bit. So on economic success, the type of metrics that we are suggesting deal with, your financial well-being, your assets and debt, your wealth holdings, how much you earn, how much income you have, where that income comes from, your human capital, whether, if you have a job, what are the characteristics of the job quality and benefits, and then also who you're living with and are you experiencing material hardships. Pretty standard measures for those who think about economics. The power and autonomy measures, there are a lot of measures. Some of you might have seen some of them before. Basically, the questions all get at, do you feel you have a sense of control over your life? Do you feel that by your own actions, you can achieve goals? And then for being valued in community or dignity, these questions get at, do you feel safe in your neighborhood? Do you feel connected? Do you feel you have social capital? Do you have people you can rely on? And so here are a host of measures. Let me go into a little more detail about a couple of measures just so you get more of a sense of what we're talking about. So for example, on the power and autonomy dimension of mobility, one metric we suggest is the kind of person scale. It's a 6-point scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree, where people respond to questions like, everyone, no matter who they are, can significantly change their basic characteristics. There's some flip coding of the questions, but in general, the scale works by a higher score reflects a growth mindset, which means your efforts can cause improvement. Lower score reflects a fixed mindset where what you do doesn't really matter. Now, there's research that shows that folks with higher scores on this scale are more likely to move out of poverty. In the toolkit, if you drill down here, you would see who the questions are geared towards, how the scale was developed, the research behind the scale, how to use the scale, and you can even download the questions into an instrument that you're working with. Similarly, let's look at a valued in community metric. For example, the UCLA loneliness scale. That's a 4-point scale from never to always on 20 questions, such as how often do you feel left out? Higher scores here indicate more loneliness. And again, there is research that shows that higher scores on the loneliness scale are correlated with trouble in other areas related to social mobility. And there's a link between loneliness, poor quality relationships, and poverty. Again, the loneliness, if you are using the toolkit, you can see what the measure is, what the research behind it was, validation of the measure, how the scale works, and even download the questions from the scale. So, we are using these metrics now in our work to see if they provide more insight when we're looking at low-income populations and mobility. We would encourage, we hope more people use these measures. So this is at the individual level. Moving next to the local level. After the Mobility Partnership finished up its work, the Gates Foundation was interested in investing more in actually encouraging mobility and using metrics to boost mobility. And they were quite taken with, again, the work of Raj Chetty, as many of us were, which suggests that where you grow up really affects where you end up. And that there are certain neighborhoods, certain communities that are launchpad neighborhoods for mobility, where others aren't quite as supportive of mobility. And so what we had been tasked with was identifying metrics that indicate whether a neighborhood is encouraging mobility or whether it's setting the groundwork for mobility, and identifying those metrics and seeing if communities want to use them and how they could use them. So to identify these metrics, we again brought together a working group of 10 scholars and engaged with communities at different parts of the country to identify what at a community level drives mobility and how we can measure it. This work is summarized in Boosting Upward Mobility Metrics to Inform Local Action. Lexicographic advantage notwithstanding on the authorship on this paper. So the framework that we developed in Boosting Upward Mobility, again, keeping all three dimensions in the forefront, economic success being valued in community and power and autonomy, we identified three main drivers of mobility at the community level. Communities need to have strong and healthy families. They need to be supportive of their members, and they need to create opportunities to earn and learn. I just describe a little bit more about the drivers. So strong and healthy families, we argue that a secure and stable home environment is the essential foundation for children's healthy development and education, and that accomplishments in school and economic success, those accomplishments generate feelings of empowerment. Supportive communities, that basically you need to feel safe where you live. And a safe, inclusive community is where people grow up, it's where people go to work, it's where people interact. And strong, inclusive communities increase people's chances to thrive and succeed. And finally, opportunities to earn and learn. So education, from kindergarten on up into workforce development programs and post-secondary training are a crucial avenue for economic success and social mobility. And then, work in the US constitutes the most important means for economic security and advancement. So the framework level, we have these three drivers. Then drilling down to the drivers, we needed to identify predictors for mobility. And we needed to have a limited enough sense of predictors that communities didn't want to track 100 different indicators, but 3, 4, 5 weren't going to be enough to actually touch on all aspects of mobility. So working with our panel of advisors, speaking with communities throughout the US, relying on the literature to see, what are the predictors that do have a strong evidence base linked to aspects of mobility. We were able to winnow a list of over 80 predictors down to 25 that we think are really important to capture all three dimensions of mobility from poverty. Once we had the predictors, we had to figure out how to measure them, or what are the best metrics. And so we had a set of criteria for identifying metrics for the predictors. First, they had to be a valid measure of the predictor, that what we are measuring actually is correlated and reflective of this predictor of mobility. To be useful for communities, we felt they had to be repeated at regular intervals. They had to be available widely for cities and counties nationwide. We wanted them to be collected consistently and calculated consistently over time. Because the process of mobility looks very different by race and ethnicity, we wanted to be able to disaggregate them by subgroups. And we also didn't want them to be overly sensitive to residential moves in and out of a jurisdiction. So for example, the poverty rate can go down in a county, not because the poor people in the county get more income, but because the poor people in the county move out, or because a bunch of rich people move in. As we move through the list of our recommended metrics, you'll see that it's very hard for these metrics to meet all of these criteria. And so we had to make trade-offs between the importance of the predictor and the other criteria. Now, most significantly, we wanted to make sure our predictor was valid, but there are trade-offs in terms of availability. Some of the predictors just weren't going to be widely available. Some of them are sensitive to movements, and so we are mindful of the limitations. But these were our goals in selecting metrics. And again, this is part of a learning process. We want to continue to refine and improve and identify the most useful metrics. So structuring our metrics through drivers. First, focusing on strong and healthy families, we wanted to focus on financial well-being, which we're measuring using income, specifically income at the 20th, 50th, and 80th percentiles at the community level for now, we're measuring communities as counties. Financial security, we were hoping to do something with wealth, but that's really hard to measure. So we ended up selecting the share of households with debt and collections, which we could obtain through credit bureau data. And that's kind of a canary in a coal mine measure, that once you not only have debt, but you can't service that debt, that's an indicator of a real problem. Housing, we're using a measure of affordable housing, which is the ratio of housing units that are affordable to families with low and very low incomes. Housing instability and homelessness, we're looking at child homelessness for that. For family structure and stability, this was a hard metric to land on, but we're looking at the share of children in various family living arrangements. In the US context, for the most part, married two-parent families are more stable. There's some racial and ethnic differences there. It's that's a limitation, but that's the metric we've landed on. I won't spend a ton of time on each of the metrics, but I want to give you a flavor. For overall health, we're looking at the share of adults who rate their own and their children's health as good or excellent. That's not widely available in survey items, so that's something we're going to suggest that local jurisdictions collect through their own original data collection efforts. Access and utilization of health services, where you have an indicator of whether you live in a health professional shortage area. And for neonatal health, we're looking at the share of children born with low birth weights. Children born at low birth weights are at increased risk of developmental challenges and health challenges going forward. The next driver being supportive communities. We're looking at political participation, the share of the voting eligible age population who actually turns out to vote. That's an indicator of social engagement and feeling that you have power in your community. We also have descriptive representation, which is, do the elected officials in your jurisdiction, do their demographics reflect the demographics of the underlying population? Safety is quite important, and we're looking at things like exposure to trauma and rates of violent crime in your community. But it's not just crime, it's also how criminal justice activities are enforced. And so we also have an indicator of overly punitive policing, and we're looking at the rate of juvenile arrests to measure that. Neighborhood characteristics, including aspects of segregation, concentration of poverty, racial diversity, belongingness and social capital, we feel are really important to feeling valued in community and dignity. We don't have great nationally level collected information on that. So here we're suggesting local level data collection, the inclusion of others and self-scale for belongingness, and aspects of the social community benchmark survey scale, focusing more on bridging social capital to measure that. Transportation is important. We have transportation access and cost measures, and healthy air, healthy environment is important. So we are using the air quality index, which we can get from EPA. The last driver, opportunities to earn and learn. We want to look at access to preschool for the youngest children. We want to look at how effective the public education system is, which we're measuring that by improvements in reading scores, English language scores from age 3 to 8, from grade 3 to grade 8. We're measuring student poverty concentration, because students who are in high poverty schools tend to perform worse. We also want kids to be ready to get more schooling, so college readiness. That was a hard one to measure because of state to state variation in graduation tests and graduation requirements. We settled on the share of kids who are 19 and 20 who actually have high school degrees, because by and large you need a high school degree to move on to college. And on the work side, we're looking at the employment to population ratio for those 25 to 54 at the county level, and then access to jobs paying a living wage. And there we're using the ratio of pay on the average job from the quarterly census of employment and wages relative to the cost of living based on MIT's living wage calculator. So these are the metrics that we're suggesting that localities, counties, cities use if they're interested in seeing if their communities are providing a platform for mobility and actually encouraging mobility for their residents. We want them to compare their community's metrics to peer communities. We want to highlight the interconnection of those metrics. We want the communities to set targets for improving those metrics, prioritize the metrics they want to emphasize, and to actually monitor, see if they're making progress over time. And it's more than a wish on the part of the Gates Foundation and Urban. We are providing grants to communities who want to use these metrics, test them out, to develop strategies to improve mobility, upward mobility for their residents. So we have begun an RFP process where counties who are interested in using metrics to help boost mobility from poverty for their residents can get technical assistance and an investment from the Gates Foundation, $125,000 to cover their planning costs to actually test out these metrics. We started with a letter of inquiry process. We had 64 applicants, 64 counties, and some consortia of counties. We've winnowed that down to 25 who've been invited to submit a full proposal, and we expect to fund 8. And again, this is a learning process where we want to see how counties use the data, how useful the data are, and can they devise, evidence-based, data-driven solutions to improve mobility. Let me try to show you the data that we have already collected for and I'm not sure what screen you're seeing right now, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen and reshare the screen. And then what Urban has done is to amass a data set for all 3,000 plus counties in the US for the most recent year available for all the metrics that do not require original data collection. And that will be available to counties and to researchers. We're in the process of expanding that data set to disaggregate these top level metrics by race, ethnicity, and sometimes gender and income when appropriate. And also adding more historical data to them. So to give you an example of how with the data we're providing to counties and the type of information, the way the information is accessible for the hypothetical county of Upward County in the state of mobility, we're organized by drivers. And then within each driver, there's the predictor. So here is financial well-being, and you can see the income at different percentiles. We have an assessment of the quality of the data, the source of the data, and information on how to use the metric on through all the metrics, some of which you are familiar with, some of which may be less familiar. So that is pretty much that. I do want to provide one more screen share, which is in the PowerPoint, to provide links to all the material that I cited in the toolkits. And the key takeaways here are that mobility from poverty is about more than just money, that you really need to focus not only on economic success, but also power and autonomy and dignity, belongingness, feeling valued in the community. That we can and should be measuring all aspects of individual and community level mobility from poverty. And that this really is a learning process. We now have a set of tools to measure all these aspects of mobility. We really want to see, do they work? How can we improve them? What more insights can we gain by taking this broader perspective? And that is all I got.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Let me recognize, turn the floor to Patricia Ruggles for a comment, and then we'll have some time for questions.
Okay. Well, Greg, that was really, really interesting. And I'm going to ask you a question you've probably gotten before, which is, how can you tell the difference between causation and correlation here? I mean, it's really easy for me to believe that low income, lack of respect and community and feelings of powerlessness all go together. But how do you tell what's driving what?
I have gotten that question before. And I think that the joint causation and the interconnectedness of the measures is really the story. So I don't think that you can move one and expect all the others to move. That in fact, they are correlated and they are interrelated to the extent that movement on one is not going to be enough. That if you don't make progress on all the dimensions, you are likely to see short-lived or very limited progress. And so until you get all three going in the right direction, you're going to have very limited mobility and only marginal improvements in mobility from poverty. So we don't feel that you could, the reason we have 25 metrics at the local level and a host of metrics at the individual level is that you're not moving poverty, you're not moving mobility unless you're making progress on all. And there is no silver bullet. There is no one thing that if we could just do that, we could have progress. So it's not really a question. Researchers care about causation, and it would be great if we had that one trick or two tricks that we could do. That doesn't seem to be the case here after doing this for a long time individually and generationally. So we think that if you really want to improve mobility, you have to attend to all three dimensions. It's not causal, it's all correlated. And for sustained success, you need to move them on all three. So that's our hypothesis as a learning agenda.
Well, that ties into last week we heard from Bill Rogers that there is no silver bullet for fixing low wages either. So I guess the one thing that we academics tend to agree on is that it's all complicated. So
I produced a fistful of silver bullets for Bill.
So you need a whole arsenal is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. Well, I believe that we probably need a whole arsenal. That's where I could go. Your measures of mobility from poverty mostly look at where in the distribution of total income or whatever it is that you're measuring against you are. Presumably for, at least on the relative measure, presumably for people to move out, other people have to move in. Mm-hmm. So have you looked at all at downward mobility or, as a society, are we especially interested in whether there's more turning or less turning, or are we more interested in allowing people opportunities? I mean, how do you distinguish between those things?
So I think ultimately what we want to see is absolute mobility and fair shared growth. I think would be the goal. We have not focused on downward mobility or economic volatility in this body of work. In other work that I've done, I've looked at that a bit, and I can talk about it if you'd like, but the focus here is to sort of acknowledge that there's a lot of stickiness at the bottom, that stickiness at the bottom is true whether you consider it in relative terms with churning mm-hmm. or in absolute terms, and that if we want to see absolute growth and more opportunity, we need to be attentive in our program design and our structures that a sole focus on economic indicators is inadequate, and that allowing people or having people have more control over their lives and having a greater sense of dignity are co-equally important. And if we want to see more mobility, we need to address them. So if you think in terms of programs, right, you can provide people more income through a program like TANF, which we can talk about the merits of the program, and there are many, but having to verify your income and going to an office can be a very unpleasant process that's not really consistent with power and autonomy, not really consistent with dignity. Compare that to another transfer program like the Earned Income Tax Credit, where you're paying your taxes, you feel like you're part of the community, you feel like it's an earned benefit. Not only does it provide the material income you need to low-income families, but it all does so in a way that is consistent with power and autonomy and with dignity.
But if you look at how much each of those programs move people out of poverty, the first thing you notice is that a whole lot more people are getting money out of the Earned Income Tax Credit. And that maybe the reason TANF doesn't work isn't just that it's, makes people feel bad. It's also that they're not giving out very much money.
Right. Yes, and you're also only looking at the economic aspect of mobility.
Yeah.
And if you want people to be sustained out of poverty, it's not just giving them money. That's an important part. It's also feeling that allowing them to feel or develop the feeling that they can control where the money comes from and how it's spent, and that they are part of a sustainable community and a value.
I believe those things are important, and that they improve individual sense of well-being. But I also believe that in general, having more money improves your sense of power and autonomy, for example. So, it's really, really hard for me to think about, you identify specific drivers, but it's hard for me to see those as drivers rather than as correlates. It's true, I'm an old-fashioned type of girl here, but I still believe that if you give people more money, they'll be happier,
I've noticed that at a personal level. I said I've noticed that at a personal level.
Yes. And that, yes, how you relate, where you are relative to other people in society is important. But if you're really, really interested in a relative measure, then you got to start thinking about taking money away from rich people too. So it's kind of like, you need to focus on what exactly are your goals here. And if your goal is to improve people's feelings of power, community, and their material well-being all together, then yes, obviously you've got to work on all three together, right? But it's to some extent your prescription falls out of your measure.
It's comforting that way. So I think that the sole focus on income is inadequate. That income is crucially important, but these other dimensions are also crucially important. And the feeling is that on the part of the partnership is that they were co-equal. Other people have seen them as there's a hierarchy and a subordination. That is, a fine opinion to have. Even if you see it as a subordination, sustained I would posit that sustained improvement in economic circumstances is not possible without moving the other dimensions as well. You're going to hit headroom and a
Yeah.
tide undercurrent. There's probably a water metaphor here, but I'm having trouble with it right
Yeah.
now.
Well, I
Let me
easily,
come at you well, first of all, I want to
Mhm,
pass on a very important question that's
mhm,
in the Q&A from one of our students, Kayla Smith,
mhm.
which is about the data. Is it available and how can one access it? Particularly this very large data set on a county by county basis.
Sure. The data will be available next year, and it will be available on a curated basis. So an email to me would be the way to go about getting it
Mm.
sooner. So, again, we've assembled the data set for 1 year at the county level, not disaggregated by race, ethnicity. That's the next set of steps. We want to make sure we're providing an adequate technical assistance to our grant applicants and our ultimate awardees before we start making it available to a broader set of researchers. And first it'll be available, curated gatekeeper format. Eventually we'll have a downloadable dashboard, but we can make it, we are planning to make it available to students and scholars sooner, so early next year.
Great, wonderful. Let me come at you with a few captious questions.
I thought that was my job.
I have no other kind. I wanted just to, first of all, to ask a little bit about the international comparisons that you started out with, because it's very common to say that the United States has less mobility than Europe. And then the chart shows Sweden, Denmark, or pick any country, Portugal. And the United States has less mobility than that country. But on the other hand, Europe is a unified economic community, and it's rigidly segregated along national lines. So if you're Bulgarian, your chances of ending up on a pension in Norway are really very small. And I wonder if anybody has ever examined that question of what the mobility is across the European Union as a whole, because I would bet we would find that the US situation by comparison on nearly is substantially more mobile, even though we are less mobile than any individual European country. Second closely related question is, what's the standard for mobility? I'm just looking at your numbers for the bottom 50%, presumably, if they start at the bottom 50%, you had perfect mobility. At the time they're adults, 50% of them would still be in the bottom. The other 50% would be at the top. That would be the standard for all children now. That the number now is about 71%, just looking at your data. About 71% at the bottom stay in the bottom. The other 39 head up to the top 50%. Now, obviously, it's stratified. They don't all get to the 20%. Don't get to the top percentile. So my question is: do we have any sense of what the desirable, what would be a good standard for this kind of intergenerational mobility, that relative mobility that one is that you're measuring and essentially provides the benchmark for this kind of work?
Okay, so two questions. Let me try to take them in turn.
Yeah.
The first one on Europe as a entire entity and not individual countries' mobility as compared to the US. That's easy. I don't know. And I would. It's the sort of question that I would pose to folks who were working with European data with the Luxembourg income study, for example. And so I would think to, reach out to Marcus Yanti or Tim Smeating or.
Yeah.
So fortunately, unfortunately, I can't answer that. The second question is, how much mobility do we expect? And, clearly there are, if it didn't matter who your parents were, if it didn't matter where you grew up, you would expect that folks in any given quintile, so say the bottom quintile, would be distributed equally throughout. So if we were seeing, 2020 all the way through, that would be perfect mobility. But that's not a reasonable standard because
Right.
there's inheritance, there's ability, there's investment, to the extent that there are structural factors that shift people into the bottom quintile, parents into the bottom quintile, that also keep their children at the bottom quintile. A lack of that mobility is a reflection of a lack of opportunity and problems in society. I don't know whether I would expect to see, 50% in the bottom quintile, still in the bottom quintile, or 40 or 30. I don't know what that number is, but I do know that when I compare the experience of Black children and white children,
That's
and
true.
see that only 26% of white children who are from the bottom quintile stay in the bottom quintile as adults, that to me serves as perhaps a benchmark for mobility. And so if I'm seeing fewer than, say, 70% of kids from the bottom quintile escape the bottom quintile overall or for specific subgroups, then I'm worried about barriers to mobility.
Yeah, yeah. Race in the United States serves the same function that nationality serves in Europe, as a kind of
Yeah.
specific barrier to mobility.
And on that
Just
note,
as an aside, we did some work years ago on inequalities of pay in Europe and the United States, and discovered that when you add in the international inequalities, the inequalities in Europe are substantially larger than they are here, by about 30%, actually, using OECD data. It's very interesting. The other question I wanted to ask is a more Johnsonian question. If you took this conversation back 50 years and you asked, how are you going to get people out of poverty? Let's say, well, the Johnson answer was, we're going to pave Appalachia and put factories there, right? And we're going to come down to the Texas colonial, to the border, and do things there. And we've got county by county data, and people live in particular places. They're raised out of poverty by economic development strategies, even by things which are essentially otherwise not necessarily highly desirable. Building the border wall, staffing up the border region with federal agents means you're hiring from the community and paying people at a decent wage. And suddenly they and their families are no longer struggling as nearly as much as they were. I wonder to what extent that kind of strategy, which is very different from this very general community building strategy that you've articulated, figures. Obviously, if you put the money where poor people are, it's ski areas in Vermont.
Sorry, what?
Even ski areas in Vermont.
Ski area. Okay, sorry, scary in Vermont.
They're not great employers, but it's better than not having any at all. And so I'm wondering to what extent that the strategy still figures in a strategy for general economic mobility.
So there, I think there is a question of, how can we see sustained economic mobility? And, the early results on the war on poverty were quite good. And the last 40 years, public policy has done a lot to improve the well-being of people, probably against much stronger headwinds than there used to be. But we are not, I don't think any of us feel we have won the war on poverty, except for maybe Bruce Meyer. And he doesn't even feel that way. But at any rate, so as we think about strategies to improve mobility at the local or the national level, just providing people, people need housing. Well, if you warehouse people in public housing towers, you've given them a place to live. But those communities were not necessarily, they had strengths, but they also had weaknesses. When we start developing policies, continue developing policies with an eye on economic opportunity, we also have to think about how those opportunities are affecting the communities where they're being imposed. Are they reducing social cohesion or improving it? Are those opportunities ones where people have not just give me a job, tell me what to do, but they feel valued on the job, they have some sense of option and control? That will be more sustainable. And so what I would like to see is, as we, develop infrastructure projects, whether it's a border wall, not the biggest fan of that infrastructure, but that's
nobody
okay.
nobody in Texas is
right.
either. I could promise you that.
Or highways, or making more sustainable cities, climate sustainable, that we do so with an eye of who are we employing, how are we engaging the communities in those, in that economic development, when we are thinking about, programs, aim, caseworker versus coaching models, for, helping folks try to negotiate challenges in their lives. How are we linking that to their economic outcomes? It's the interconnectedness of these dimensions that we feel are really important. And so, if your goal is primarily economic, fine. But if you really want sustained economic success for folks trying to come out of the bottom, you're not going to get there if you're not attentive to issues of dignity and of autonomy.
Okay, well, on that note, I'm afraid I have to make a quick trip to the University of Durham in the United Kingdom, where I'm due to give a seminar starting in 2 minutes on the global macroeconomics of inequality. So
All right.
I need to head to the airport, get on the airplane, and get over there in a flash of a light beam.
I think you're going to need a port key for that, actually.
Indeed. It is great. But on that note, let me thank you very, very much for a really fascinating presentation. And thank the audience for their attention, and thank Patricia and the LBJ School staff, Lisa and Laura, for organizing this. And we will be with you again next week with Heidi Hartman, who's speaking about women's poverty. So
my
we're really moving along through the expertise that's available on this subject. Once again, Greg Axe, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed doing it.
Yeah.
Good to see you all. Bye.
Yeah.